Right, ladies and gentlemen, it's late. I've been researching this topic for hours, and I mean hours. Now, I am abroad at the moment. If you are noticing, some of my videos are showing up network errors. Don't ask me what that's all about. Maybe it's the hotel Wi-Fi. I'm traveling quite a lot at the moment. Hopefully, when I go back to South Africa, I won't have this anymore. So if we do get network errors, please just bear with me. It's not my fault. I'm trying my best to deal with what I have as I'm traveling. But I've spent hours researching this topic. Many people messaged me and asked what the hell's going on. To be frank, I've researched it a lot, and it's actually really quite a serious story. But before I get on to the story of today, can yet again remind you, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and please make this video go viral, because I've spent hours, and I mean hours, researching this. Right, I keep talking about the Palestinian-Israel issue, and everybody keeps telling me I'm an Israeli shill and it has nothing to do with South Africa. And yeah, it's got a lot to do with you now, doesn't it? I mean, this was obvious for everybody that just stopped to smell the roses for 2 seconds. So what actually happened? Well, as you know, a load of Palestinians arrived in South Africa as refugees. We're going to talk about that. And everybody thinks, well, the drama started today. It didn't. Actually, it started on the 28th of October, where a chartered flight carrying over 168 Palestinians from Gaza reportedly landed in Tambo. Now, this was done actually rather quietly and nobody noticed. Now, they passed through immigration without much public noise or controversy, and they were taken into South Africa or onwards to other destinations. We're not 100% sure, and keep that in mind, we don't really know. But only later did things actually blow up, when some commentators were actually starting to point out that actually a flight has already landed, and that was only 2 weeks ago. Now, more than 300 Palestinians have entered South Africa on these chartered flights. So this is not a once-off event, and a corridor in use has already been established. So what happened today? Well, fast forward to 13th of November, according to the Border Management Authority, well, at roughly around 18:15 in the morning, a Global Airways charter flight from Nairobi, Kenya, landed in Tambo with 153 Palestinians. Now, I've got to be honest and say, I'm not really sure on the exact numbers. I've read numerous articles. Some of them go from 160 to 130 to 153. It's over 100, roughly around 150. Let's take it as that. Now, during the standard immigration interviews, the Border Management Authority officers noted 3 big problems. First, the group didn't clearly state how long they planned to stay in South Africa. The second is that they didn't have addresses for their accommodation in South Africa. And thirdly, their passports didn't have the usual departure stamps from their last point of exit. Now, none of them say that they want to apply for asylum at this point, but because they failed the immigration test, they were initially denied entry and kept on the aircraft while checks happened. Well, that's the procedural version at least. Now, inside the plane, the situation started to look and feel like a humanitarian crisis. Reports from the Gift of the Givers later described children and a pregnant woman, heat, lack of proper ventilation. Apparently there were delays with food and water, and at least one child had seizures, struggling with proper support. But this was all led by Soliman and the Gift of the Givers, who basically gave that story. So just take that with a pinch of salt for now. I mean, I'm not denying that it happened. I'm just saying he's the guy who gave the narrative. Now, the Gift of the Givers issued a statement and spoke to media outlets, which included IOL, Times Live, SABC, and loads of others. And their version of events had some key points. Now, they said that these were Palestinian refugees from a war zone, and South Africa had a moral duty to receive them. The crisis, Soliman says, was because Israel had refused to stamp their passports on exit. Now, you need to listen to that. Refused to stamp their passports. Now, in his letter, he further goes and claims Israel deliberately did not stamp the passports specifically to exasperate the suffering in a foreign country. Now, he praised the Border Management Authority for following their mandate by not allowing disembarkment without stamps, but frames the real villain as being Israel. I mean, it's always Israel with this guy. Now, he thanked Dirko's Dangor and Minister Ronald Lamola for stepping in, writing to Home Affairs and getting the exit stamp requirement waived for humanitarian purposes. Now, he explicitly casts this as part of South Africa's wider stance of standing with Palestine against what he calls the terrorist, genocidal, and apartheid state of Israel. Now, the media quickly adapted this and started to change their headlines. The headlines went about Palestinian refugees stranded in OR Tambo, and stories started to describe them as being denied entry due to missing Israel exit stamps. Now, the Gift of the Giver presented South Africa and themselves, specifically the Gift of the Givers, as saviors who pressured the state to do the right thing. Now, eventually, after around 12 or 13 hours, the standoff ended, and the Gift of the Givers formally committed to housing and caring for the group. Now, the Border Management Authority confirms that they processed these individuals into South Africa under the 90-day visitor-free rules for Palestinian passport holders. Now, it should be noted that by this point, 23 of the 153 refugees, remember these were refugees, had already moved on to other destinations. So we've got around 130 people who are actually now remaining under the Gift of the Giver's care. Now, politically, Cyril Ramaphosa then stepped in to tell journalists that the Palestinians appear to have been flushed out of their country. It says we cannot turn their back on them because they come from a strife-torn, war-torn area, and frames the decision as a humanitarian act of compassion. But he stressed that this is not a free-for-all at our borders. He says it's a special case and not the new norm. So far, the public story is Israel's bad, South African government was slow, but ultimately was compassionate and allowed them in, and look how heroic the Gift of the Givers is. But this is where the wheels start to come off. Right, so let's actually start to fact-check some of what's gone on. Now, first off, the Israeli embassy in South Africa went public and said, Israel does not stamp passports on exit for anybody. Now, I'm going to confirm that. I've been to Israel like literally within the last few weeks. And when you arrive, they give you a slip. It's kind of like a really weird kind of like paper slip. That's your visa. They don't stamp it. And you have to keep that piece of paper with your passport at all times. And I'll be honest, when I was in Israel, it was a pain in the ass. Like you're worried constantly to lose this little flappy piece of paper that could be just disappear at any point in time. And Israel hasn't done this for years. Instead, they use this electronic record and paper slips as their stamps. Now, the reason they say they kind of do this is also kind of like to help you, because you may go back to your country, have an Israel stamp, and your country gets a bit funny with you. I can kind of see how that would work. But anyway, Israel says there's no ways they refused to stamp people's passports as a malicious act. Well, they don't do it for anybody. It's just not their standard process. So they can't refuse to do something that they don't do. Now, Israeli officials then went on to explain more of the background. They said that this was a structured corridor for Gazans to leave via Roman airport under internationally coordinated agreements. So effectively, this is Gazans can go there, they can use an Israeli airport, it's the second largest airport, they can go wherever they want. So people who are generally on the list of people that leave via that airport are usually patients, caregivers, dual nationals, or people with valid visas for third-party countries. So they exit Gaza only after the destination countries have been confirmed and that they've been told them. And Israel has already facilitated tens of thousands of such departures since the war. They've not blocked them. They've let them go wherever they want. So as an example, if you got a student visa, and there's many of those in, say, Western Europe, maybe in England or in France, that's the airport you're going to go under, and you're going to go under one of these internationally coordinated agreements. So Israel has facilitated tons of these. Now, this is also in contrast to some of the Islamic propaganda, which is usually that Israel stops people from leaving this war-torn zone so they can commit genocide. Well, it's kind of not really the case. So as far as Israel is concerned, there was no sabotage going on here. They were a facilitator of a legal departure. Now, Tim Flack went and did a deep dive, which he published in Biz News, and it's a very good deep dive. He says that Gazans register through intermediaries, and they have to pay fees which are roughly between $1,700 US up to 2,000 US. They generally get vetted and approved by the Israeli coordination officers. Then they fly out of this airport and they transit through airports like Nairobi. Now, he notes that Kenya didn't stamp the passports because they were in transit. They didn't enter Kenya. So the lack of Kenyan stamps is also a standard airport procedure, not some dark conspiracy. Now, Flack says that the missing stamps crisis was never really about Israel, and the real problem was South Africa's chaotic border handling and poor coordination, and that the country allowed one NGO's leader's story to set the political and media agenda without basically fact-checking a bit. Now, for those of you who don't know, Soliman's the leader of the National Dialogue. He's the guy who's running it. Like, the guy is seriously bad news. He is on record as saying the only law that matters to him is Islamic law, and he's broken the law numerous times in the country in order to push an Islamic legal framework. He doesn't actually hide his contempt for the state as long as he gets what he wants in terms of his Islamic beliefs. In fact, you can actually watch that right here.
All of you in your shops, don't be afraid to speak out. That's the least you can do. When you fear Allah, other people fear you. The Quran is very clear. Strike terror into the hearts of your enemies and Allah's enemies. Don't waste your time praying Salah here and fast and go for Umrah if you're afraid. Then your faith has not transferred into action. Don't be afraid. One of those lawyers asked me, what did we achieve by going to the ICJ? I said, what kind of a dumb question is that? What did you achieve? You made 60 other countries not be afraid anymore. And they took Israel to the ICJ. It's not what we achieve, what victory is given, or what rule is passed. What's important is to tell the Zionists, we are not afraid of you.
Now, Soliman himself, in terms of the gift to the givers, doesn't believe that Israel should exist. In fact, he actually partnered very recently with a silversmith in order to provide coins that says Palestinian Liberation Movement. And in it, he shows a map of the full map of Israel. And on it, it says, from the river to the sea. Remember, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free of Jews, because that's what the slogan actually means. Well, Soliman, this is literally his viewpoints. So he's the one who's been allowed to set the narrative for the state in a typical fashion. Now, Flack goes on to say that a single phone call or statement from Soliman seemed to change the messaging of Durko, the presidency, and the Home Affairs. And that, in his view, shows that there's a fragile state capture going on by NGO narratives, rather than grounded in any form of intelligence or procedure. And that's because, to a large degree, South Africa's intelligence system just doesn't really seem to exist. Now, numerous individuals started to jump in on this. Some individuals noticed that they had visited Israel, like me, very recently, and they posted comments of their own experiences, and they confirmed that their passports weren't stamped. They called the whole Israeli refusal to stamp as misleading, and they urged public figures like Soliman to correct the record. And let's be honest, they're not going to. Now, Operation Dudula, and I've got to be honest and say, I was quite surprised they got involved in this. They issued a statement and opposed the plan to host around 150 Palestinians. They warned of national security risks with unverified identities, because we don't know who these individuals are. We don't know why they were here. Remember, they didn't even tell us why they were going to be here. That was one of the reasons they were detained. And Operation Dudula notes that this is all happening at the same time of the G20 summit. And they deeply concerned by the apparent influence of NGOs, specifically gift to the givers, over government decisions in sensitive areas. Now, the Palestinian embassy in South Africa, of course we got one of them, they distanced themselves from the actual logistics of the trip, because who chartered the plane? Where were they going? We don't know. Now, it blames an unregistered and misleading organization for arranging the flights. Now, who the hell's this unregistered organization? This is leading some individuals to say, was it the gift to the givers? Well, we don't know. They say that it was all part of desperate families who were charged money. Remember, it was between 1,700 and 2,000 US, and they were flown without proper coordination. And they thanked the South African government for sorting out the mess once it landed on the doorstep. Now, once the dust started to settle, well, Home Affairs Minister Leon Schreiber, remember that's DA Home Affairs Minister, and the Border Management Authority refined their message, and they confirmed that there was a group of 153 Palestinian pass holders who arrived on a chartered plane from Nairobi, and they had valid passports and 90-day visa-free entry, and that they didn't meet the standard entry requirements at first because there was no clear accommodation address, no return tickets. Remember, no return tickets. Where they're going to go, they know. And no customary departure stamps. Now, Leon Schreiber emphasized that none of the 153 have applied for asylum. So they're not actually being classed as refugees or asylum seekers in law. They're just here as visa-exempt travelers, which is kind of odd because there's no return flight. So how are they going to go home? Where they're going on to? Why they're here? Don't know. Border Management Authority says that whilst verification was happening, vulnerable travelers were moved off the plane and into air-conditioned buses. Remember, this was the report that there were people overheating and some kids having seizures and whatever else. And they claimed that nobody had just been left to bake on the tarmacs, as some of the stories suggested. Now remember that some of the stories, it wasn't some of the stories, it was Soliman's story. He said that they had just been left there to bake in the sun and die on the plane as a humanitarian issue. Now, once the Gift of the Givers formally committed to housing and supporting these Palestinians, Home Affairs signed off and the Border Management Authority processed them, and they walked away with the normal visa-exempt visitors rules. So that's the legal process. Now, what's actually going to happen to them? Are they going to get lost in the system? Are they actually going to get shipped out the country? Who knows? But the government has said that they are announcing a multi-agency probe. I mean, as you know, there's always going to be a probe and the government's always going to screw it up. They want to determine who actually organized the flights, why they arrived in such a confused and uncoordinated way, and how they can prevent this from becoming a broader policy by surprise NGO interventions. And it's another example of an NGO in the country undermining the rule of law. And we've said on Morning Shot numerous times, NGOs in South Africa are a huge problem. And it's no wonder some countries just ban them outright, because when you see stuff like this occurring, you can kind of understand the logic. So let's get on to the big questions. So who actually organized the flight? Well, if you read all the documents, well, the Global Airways, it's just a normal airline. And it was subcontracted by KT Air, an Israeli-linked charter company. Now, the Palestinian embassy says that some unregistered, misleading organization collected money from families and arranged travel without proper coordination. We also know that there are some forms of international intermediaries, most of them Islamic-run and Palestinian freedom states, who run flights out of the Ramon Corridor pipeline. So let's be honest for 1 second and say that this looks like a private, semi-commercial evacuation pipeline using an authorized Israeli corridor run by a fixer-type organization with governments only partially looped in. So to say that this was all a conspiracy of Israel, don't think so. More likely to be a ploy of NGOs, maybe even a ploy of Gift of the Givers, or maybe it's one of the other pro-Palestinian liberation NGOs. We don't know, and that's an important point. We still don't know. Yeah, we've got Palestinians in South Africa and we don't know why they're there. Yeah, that should worry you. Anyway, the Gift of the Givers says that they did not organize the flight as so far as any official records show. So we can't categorically say it was them. Might speculate it was them. We might say they had an involvement. Wasn't actually them officially, right? So their role only really starts when the plane arrives on ground, when it actually lands in South Africa. And their involvement so far has been to advocate publicly for the group, to blame Israel for the stamp issue that never actually existed, so it just shows you the misinformation that they're pushing, and to pressure Home Affairs and DIRCO to let the Palestinians in. And then to formally undertake to house and support around 130 people. Remember that some of the people have already pushed off and gone to another country. Don't actually know where they've gone, so that's an interesting point in itself. So the Gift of the Givers say that their involvement has been purely humanitarian and something more around political and strategic. So they have kind of shaped the narrative. And so, as you know, the narrative is that Israel was deliberately cruel and South Africa has been this morally heroic country that's just helped these poor individuals. And they are influencing policy decisions, such as the wavering stamp requirements that they got that pushed aside. And they position themselves as the primary civil society partner for Palestinian arrivals. And that in itself is a problem, because does that mean they're expecting more of these? So, is Soliman just being a pro-Palestinian as a Muslim, or was he actually involved? Well, we can say that he is openly and stridently pro-Palestinian. As you can see from his official statements, he calls Israel a terrorist, genocidal apartheid state in his official letter. But the question is Soliman's biasness leading to inaccurate claims like the stamp duty story, which has been contradicted by the Israeli embassy and independent travelers like myself and others? And there has been further suggestions from some individuals that the Gift of the Givers has donated to organizations linked to terrorism in some jurisdictions. And so it's possible that this isn't all as clean as they say it is. Now, it's important to understand that the allegations that they donated to terrorist-linked organizations, they're just accusations. They haven't been proven in a South African court of law. But they do add a form of perspective that Soliman's work is deeply political and not just neutral humanitarianism as he claims. At a minimum, you could say he's got strong ideological framing against Israel, which combined with factual claims that don't withstand scrutiny, such as the stamp issue, this is creating a risk of the South African state outsourcing its foreign policy and its border management to, well, partisan NGOs. And we have to be really cautious around where this goes. So, did Israel actually do anything wrong here? Well, let's just be blunt. From the documents and statements that we've got, though, Israel facilitated the access of Gazans through an agreed corridor, so they did that in accordance with the law. Israel doesn't stamp passports on exit as standard policy for anyone. There's no evidence in this specific case that Israel singled these travelers out for special punishment or sabotage. Now, the main criticism against Israel in this incident is Soliman's claim that Israel deliberately refused to stamp passports to cause suffering. Now, the narrative then gets amplified by parts of the South African media and the political class who are just retarded and don't do factual checking, because our media class in South Africa is dumb. So when you actually strip away the rhetoric, the claim doesn't match how Israeli border control actually works. And this is corroborated by official Israeli statements, on-the-ground travelers, and previous policy going back years. Now, the strongest evidence of wrongdoing, if you want to find somehow some form of wrongdoing with Israel, is the unregistered middleman who exploited desperate families without proper coordination. But we don't know if that was Israeli, do we? Could have been one of these Palestinian NGOs. It could be one of these other people smugglers. We don't know who they are. By all means, in stretches of imagination. Israel's done their part under international law, and they're getting lambasted for it. Like typical, right? Now, South African institutions were unprepared, slowed, and too willing to accept a politically convenient anti-Israeli narrative in this instance. It's like they didn't really even bother checking. They were like, oh, Israel bad. Get on that one. Now, this wider criticism over Israel, over Gaza, the war conduct, the humanitarian suffering, yeah, I mean, that's a much wider debate. We're not going to talk about that. But what we are going to do is we're going to look strictly at this plane, these passengers, and these documents. And all of the anti-Israel rhetoric does appear to be nothing more than ideological framing rather than fact. And in a sense, yes, you could argue that this was just the normal reflective anti-Israeli rhetoric. You could say that this even bled into anti-Semitic tropes. You could say that this was the automatic blaming of Israel for forms of misery, even though in South Africa we had a bureaucracy that just didn't bother actually doing their jobs. But ultimately, what we really should take from this is that Gift of the Givers has got involved and influenced the media narrative and the political position of the government. And that's problematic. It's highly problematic, no matter what the cause is. So that's what happened. That's how it went down. There isn't really a lot else I can tell you, because nobody knows. You know why nobody knows? Because the government didn't really check. They were too busy saying, Israel bad. Yeah, aren't we great? We're helping the Palestinians. The end. It's not really a lot more to it. But that's the story, ladies and gentlemen. Let me know what you think of the whole thing. What a disaster scenario for South Africa. Not a good day, really. But let me know what you think in the comment section below. And until next time, bye.